Welcome, and thank you for joining me for another episode of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast, coming to you from the Podvlog studio in St. George, Utah, and produced by Markel Consulting, LLC. I'm your host, Dave Markel. Welcome back. This is episode 16 of Sexual Assault Survivor Stories, the SAS podcast. This is part one of my interview of Arci Grey. Before we dive into Arci's incredible story, I want to give you a little bit of background information about her. I met Arci. Well, I spoke to Arci. We haven't actually met in person yet. After spending some time perusing the internet looking for someone with whom I might be able to do a pod share with. A pod share is where I would invite someone on my show and then that person would invite me on their show, doing a mutual promotional gig, pod sharing. So I ran across a podcast that had a similar goal as mine, which is giving victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault a platform for telling their story and also providing an education into the trauma that an experience of rape or sexual assault brings to a person. I reached out to Arci with my proposal and explanation about my show, and we made an immediate connection of mutual respect and mutual goals. Arci told me her story of being kidnapped, tortured, and raped for 4 horrendous days, and also nearly being killed, and then of her amazing and daring self-rescue. Upon hearing this near-death experience, I immediately invited Arci to tell her story on my podcast so that you could benefit from the way that she survived and now thrives as a survivor success coach to others who've also been through the agony of rape or sexual assault. Arci's story is nothing short of stunning, but by way of warning, it is also explicit and definitely not for young ears. Please use discretion in your decision to listen and with whom you share this episode. And keep in mind that this is part one. Next week, I'll be sharing the follow-up story of Arci's amazing transformation from victim to survivor. It's also spectacular and powerful, and it's part of Arci's ongoing life, a part that continues each day to bring hope, education, and understanding of the trauma of rape and sexual assault, a fantastic coexistence with the purpose of this podcast, SAS. Here's Arci. How have you been?
Very well, just so busy.
Yeah,
it's good. It's all good stuff, right?
Yeah,
so kicking off the new year, trying to do it right, being really intentional and focused this year and just leveling up and just trying to crush more goals and just live life and take it all in. So it's been great.
The very first time we talked, you told me a lot about your near-death experience and your sexual assault. Are you willing to talk about that again for this episode?
Absolutely. I don't mind talking about it. I am an open book about it. I have done the healing. It's no longer dysregulating to talk about it. It's no longer triggering to talk about it. And I know how helpful it can be for others to hear stories. One, to know that they're not alone, that what they experienced and the things that they're probably even shaming themselves for, just like I did, are probably very normal things, normal reactions to these abnormal extreme events. And I hope that it's healing for others, at least inspiring to others to help them tackle their trauma and know that it's possible. So, yeah,
good.
Yes.
And so I think what we'll do is just kind of start off and ask you to tell us about your story. What are you able to tell me about your experience?
I think to sum it up, 2 days before my 37th birthday, I was kidnapped. I was held captive for 4 days. I was tortured for hours, zip-tied, thrown in a closet. I was beaten. I was raped multiple times. And ultimately, I escaped as a knife pierced my throat. That's in a nutshell.
That's the nutshell.
That's the nutshell.
That's a lot.
It is a lot.
Let's talk about that then, if we could. Kind of break that down for us. Start wherever you want and
Okay.
Tell us about this.
The person that did this to me is someone that I knew. We had previously dated a few years prior, and he remained in my life deliberately on his part. I had several times tried to cut ties and kind of back away slowly. And as I learned much later on, that there's only 2 ways to remove yourself from a narcissist, and it's smile and nod, back away slowly, and or turn and run. And essentially you smile and nod, back away slowly until you can turn and run. I didn't know that I needed to turn and run until it was too late. So this person had concocted a scheme to not only just keep me in his life through business ventures, he had convinced his father to hire me as a real estate agent and look for properties for them. Due to some just financial issues in their country, his father doesn't live in the United States. His father backed out of some deals. Ultimately, he blamed me. He needed someone to blame. My captor needed someone to blame, and I was his target. So he lured me to his place, and he brought me in under the premise that we were going to call his father for a real estate deal. And it was late at night, which isn't uncommon because, again, his dad lives overseas. So it would have been morning. Late night for us would have been morning for them. So it seemed plausible. And as I was in his place, a couple of hours went by and he kept changing the subject. And I kept asking, well, is it time to call your dad? Like, come on, let's get this done. Like, I want to go to bed. I want to go home. I want to go to bed. At this point, it was midnight. He just wouldn't let me leave. He was literally blocking my exit from his place. I, at one point, was like, that's it, I'm going. And I picked up my shoes and I went to walk toward the front door, and he got right in my face and he chest bumped me basically and pushed me back and just started getting aggressive. I did something that in hindsight, we do these things in the moment. In hindsight, I look at it and I'm like, that was dumb. I probably shouldn't have done it. But there was a survival mechanism kicking in, and I hit him across the face with my shoes as an attempt to get away. And that triggered him to then pick me up by my throat and choke me. He slammed me into the sofa and he held me there until I passed out. I don't know how long I was out. Could have been a few seconds and it could have been a few minutes. I don't know. I woke up as I was flying across the room and I landed basically on my hands and knees, and he was beating my back. And that beating went on for several hours. He would pick me up, he would throw me against the wall, he would grab me by my hair and slam my head against the mullions in the window, these big metal mullions in the window. He threw me across the room. I hit my head on the fireplace. At that point, I started to get a little bit of tunnel vision. I'm sure I had a concussion at that point. And the entire time this was going on, he had my cell phone and he was just in this rage, and it was like Jekyll and Hyde watching his face change. He would calm himself down and he'd come back and he'd get to this almost apologetic state, and then he would go through my cell phone and he would find any man's name in there. I mean, I had professional contacts. I was a professional architect at this time. I was doing real estate development. I had real estate agents and construction workers, and my phone was filled with men's names, and every single one he would find, he'd go and look for text messages that I would have sent to them. And he would just manipulate every message. And then he would ask me about these people. And every time he's like, you're lying, you're lying, you're lying. And he'd beat me up. And then this just went on and on and on, this aggressive rage. And the place that it happened was right next to a commuter, like a train station. So I had a lot of sensory deprivation. You don't really know how long things are going on for. And my best guess was this was probably about, 6 or 8 hours worth of beating. And so much so that he hurt himself in hitting me. He hurt his wrist and his shoulder because he was just beating me, punching me. And so he switched to a bamboo rod. He went and found a bamboo rod about 18 inches long, and it had these like really sharp little burrs on it. And he would sit there and twist it until he lined up the burr, like this really sharp piece. And then he would hit me with it to make sure that it would do even more damage. He hit me over the head with it. I mean, so many times. My hair was it was just all blood. It was just all red. That lasted, like I said, my guess was about 8 hours based on the trains that I started hearing going by. And then something switched in him. And like I said, it was like Jekyll and Hyde. And he would come back down and be a completely different person. At one point, he got apologetic and was like, let me get you some ice, like like you're bruised and this is hurting. I didn't find out till later, but I had a retinal detachment as part of it. And I watched like half of my vision go black and white. And when he was apologetic, I just would feed into it, like, let him feel like he was rescuing me or helping me, because you just have to switch like I had to be on my toes as quickly as his personality would switch. I would have to be on my toes. And so I told him about that. And then he was like, oh, I have a friend who's a doctor. I'm going to call that friend. Of course, he never did. But there were all these moments back and forth where he wanted to be the rescuer. He wanted to be the one that saved me. And then he would realize how much trouble he would be in if he let me go. So then as soon as he had those moments of panic, he'd go right back in to just beating me. And then he started scheming like how he was going to get out of it. So he started asking me like, okay, like how long does it take for your bruises to go away? What makeup do you use to cover up bruises? All of these different schemes and things to try to he was trying to plan his way out of it. So that was a Tuesday night. Yeah. So that first night was a Tuesday night. Over the next few days, so after that beating, and he was exhausted, he was drinking, and I never saw him do cocaine, but I absolutely know he was on it because he used to keep some in his house, and I hated it. Anytime I ever saw any drug paraphernalia, like when we were dating, I was like, I don't want anything to do with this. And I would leave or whatever, and he would always blame it like on his brother or something like that. But I saw evidence of it out everywhere. So I'm sure that's what was keeping him awake for 4 days. So after that first night, and he had sort of calmed down again, he started scheming and was looking at trying to find different things on the internet. Like one of the things he was looking up, he's like, I'm going to find a contract for, this is ridiculous. He was trying to find a contract for porn videos to try and force me to sign something saying that what the evidence of what I experienced was that I had signed this thing. So by the second day-ish, again, I had no idea that when I finally escaped, it had been 4 days. I had lost all concept of time. I had no idea how many days it was, with the exception of like, sort of counting a sunset when I could see one. The first portion of this all happened in the first night in and around his living room area. And when he calmed down and was being almost apologetic and was like bringing me ice or trying to, I don't even know what really, it was whatever was going on in his mind, really. It was the cycle of abuse that he had to cycle through. And if anybody doesn't know, the cycle of abuse starts with the honeymoon phase where everything's great and fine. And then there's this tension that builds up, and it's usually a minor little aggression. They'll make fun of you, or you'll say something and they'll pretend that they're offended, but it has to be this tension that builds up, and they will create a scenario with that. And then what'll happen is the explosion, right? The tension blows up, all that tension builds, and then it blows up, and there's this explosion. And the explosion is abuse. It starts out as emotional, verbal, and eventually will grow into physical violence. I've never known any case that it doesn't, to be honest. And then it goes into this apology phase. And the apology phase starts out as them apologizing to you and telling you that they'll never do it again and everything's great. And then they go back into the honeymoon phase where they're complimenting you, or they're buying you gifts, or they're doing whatever their love language is, because it's not about your love language. It's always about theirs. Whatever makes them feel loved, they'll do to you, and they'll rope you back in, they get you back in again. And then it starts again, and a tension will build up until it explodes. And what happens in the cycle of abuse is the honeymoon phase gets smaller and smaller and smaller, and the explosions get bigger and bigger and bigger. And that's where it goes from, like I said, little micro verbal aggressions to, they always hit the wall before they hit you, those type of things. So he was cycling through that. In our relationship, we dated for about 1.5 years, a couple of years prior to this incident. And during our relationship, that cycle had happened probably 3 or 4 times, and it was getting more frequent. So now 3 years later, when being held captive and he's torturing me, this cycle is happening every few hours. He's stuck in this loop. And of course, I didn't know and recognize in the time. I was absolutely in survival mode. I mean, you shut down your cognitive abilities to think. There is no planning. And I'm a strategic thinker. That's like my number one strength. That's what I do. And so not having access to that strength, that ability, was also very frustrating for myself, because I did a lot of shaming to myself, like, you idiot, why can't you figure your way out of this? Like, I'm a problem solver. That's what I do. So it was frustrating. Those moments of him being apologetic and calm were finally, like, my survival mode would calm down enough to where I could get into some strategizing and planning and thinking and trying to escape. So at one point, he was in his kitchen I was in his living room and I would have to go by his kitchen in order to get to the front door. There was only one way out. It was a high-rise condo. We were a couple hundred feet in the air. And so there was no way out other than to the front door. So the only way for me to do that was, I thought, to go to the bathroom. And at this point, I had my cell phone back in my hand. And actually, did I? Yes, at this point I did. I had my cell phone back in my hand. And I went to the bathroom and he was listening. He's like, leave the door open. I'm like, okay. So I take that back. I'm sorry. I have absolutely remembered this completely out of order. It's funny how our memories work, right?
Very typical with
it's insane
trauma memory.
And I've told this story 100 times. And it's so funny that
happens.
like, even sometimes I take that back. Before the beating is when I told him I had to go to the bathroom. And he wouldn't let me leave. So in the beginning, he wouldn't let me leave. And I said that I needed to go to the bathroom. And he told me, leave the door open. And I went to the bathroom, which is near the front door. And I left the door open and I flushed the toilet. And then I waited like as long as I could without it being too obvious. And I turned the faucet on in the water. And then I turned to run for the front door so that things would sound like they were going as normal. You wash your hands, flush the toilet, wash your hands. And I made it out the front door and to the elevators. And then he came after me with a knife. And then he dragged me back in. And then I was in the living room. And then I tried to leave. And then I hit him in the face with the shoe. And then he started beating me. So I don't know how I had transposed that, but I guess that's what happens with trauma too, is our memories get disjointed.
Yeah.
And I think you and I were talking about this in one of our conversations, you coming from the law enforcement side of things. And,
right.
Witnesses can seem really uncredible when their stories don't line up, but there's a perfect example. This is 4 years later, and I've told this story 100 times, and somehow my brain reorganized that.
So typical.
In the moment.
Yeah. Not surprised at all. I mean, some of our audience might be confused by that, but we'll talk about that. When you get through your story and we start talking about some of the neuroscience of all this trauma that you've been through, we'll delve into that. But it's common.
That's the best part. I love that stuff.
Yeah. We're going to get there. I know there's a whole lot more because you said this lasted for 4 days.
Yes.
But if I could just take a moment to interrupt and ask.
Absolutely.
What are you able to tell me about your initial thoughts when he comes after you with a knife?
So at that point, like I said, I had my phone with me. I had everything I needed to leave. I had my keys and my phone, and I was like, okay, I'm just going to go, because there had been this tension that was building up. I'm like, this isn't cool. Like, this is not, it got to the point where, a couple of years prior, when we would have these tension and these arguments, I knew how to just shut him down and walk away from it. I'd roll my eyes and be like, you're an idiot. And I was gone. I wouldn't take the BS. I mean, that's why we broke up, because there was all this BS and lies and stuff. And so it got to a point where when he wouldn't let me leave, I was like, yeah, I don't have control of this situation. So that's why it was, pretend to wash your hands and run away. When he came out with a knife, because everybody's like, well, why didn't you call 911? Well, because I didn't know that attempted murder was on the table at this point. Like, it was so far out of my capacity to understand that, right? Like, it's just not even on the radar at all.
Yeah.
So, going to the elevator, and it's the middle of the night, nobody's around, like no one else is in or out of their apartment. Midnight. It's probably maybe even past midnight at this point. Mm-hmm. And he comes out with a knife, and I was like, whoa. And I had hit the elevator button so many times. You just like, okay, you go. At that point, if he's willing to come out with a knife, I had no control of the situation. All bets were off at that point. Any of my normal tactics and communication with him, my ability to brush him off and just pull away, which had always worked in the past, where it's like, I'm not saying for anyone ever to use that as a way to try to manipulate a narcissist, because their full-time job is manipulation. They're experts in it. But that's what would typically work. It's like, you know what? I'm not dealing with this. I'm done. Like, anytime he was fishing or playing the victim or anything like that, I would just treat it like any healthy other relationship. I wouldn't fall to, I wouldn't bow to his manipulative ways typically. My normal ways of doing that there's no way it was outside of my control. There was no way that when someone comes after you with a knife and grabs the back of your shirt and is like, let's go. In hindsight, could I have stayed? Could I have screamed? And could I have hoped that the elevator would open and I knew the elevator had a camera in it. Sure. In hindsight, all of that makes sense. In the moment, none of that exists. None of that exists at all. You just comply. That's your survival brain, right? It shuts down. And I can't wait to talk about the neuroscience of this, because that's exactly what happens. Your rational thought and your emotions disappear. It was just, okay, just get through this moment. Don't die right now, and go back with him. And I started recognizing this pattern that he was getting into. It took probably 2 or 3 cycles of it for me to recognize that he is in a pattern of aggression, apology, aggression, apology, aggression, apology. And I knew in those apologetic moments, it was the only time to communicate with him. So to answer your question of what was I thinking, I wasn't just, okay, I don't have control, and just survive the next moment. Rule number 1, no dying. That's there's something I'm working on right now, a really big thing that I'm working on with my clients. Yeah, you've seen some of it actually.
That's great.
Yeah. And again, it's all in hindsight. You realize all these things, but if you know it, in the beginning. So yeah, it's rule number 1, no dying. And your brain knows exactly what to do not to die. As much as I spent probably a couple of years shaming myself for, why didn't I call 911 at that time? Why didn't I scream? Why didn't I? All these things that we think about after in hindsight. And it's like, wait a minute. I did every single thing right because I'm still here. Everything that I needed to do, everything I did, it was the right choice in that moment because I survived. No shame. So,
and that's survival brain right there. I mean, you're, like you said, everything else goes away and your brain does whatever it has to do to survive that. And you survived that for 4 days.
Yeah. So that was just the beginning.
What are you able to tell me about the things like eating and drinking water or whatever? What did he facilitate?
In the first apologetic phase where he brought me ice, he brought me water. I mean, again, when your survival brain's on, everything else is shut down. This went on for a couple of days. So the first rape occurred, I believe it was in the first night. And that was part of his scheming, actually. So he dragged me into his guest room, his second bedroom, and he brought in like lingerie that he had. I'm sure he had a stash. He had plenty of girlfriends that were unsuspecting, much like myself in the beginning. And he forced me to put them on. And then he recorded videos and he scripted things for me to say on video. And if I said it wrong, because I was trying to say things in these videos that would be obvious, like I realized what he was doing. He was creating a mountain of evidence to prove that it was consensual. That's what he was trying to do. He was trying to back his way out of it. And even his attorney much later on had come up to me and said, no one asks for this. And so for his attorney to break protocol and talk to the victim directly and say that, at first when I heard it, I was like, F you, buddy, go away. Like I don't want to talk to you. It took me a while to realize that that was just his attorney being a human, just being a human. And he apologized to me. His attorney apologized to me and said, I'm so sorry you had to go through that. And no one asked for this. But so he had gone and gotten this lingerie and he made me put it on. And there was a lot of things that he was scripting for me and saying, you have to say this and do this and whatever. And I did. And I deliberately messed it up many times, trying to slip in certain words, like visibly showing my fear. My guess is like 10, 15 times I had to say the same thing over and over and over. And every time I got it wrong, I took a beating and we started all over again. So eventually, as much as my cognitive mind was like, say it wrong so it messes up his evidence, say it wrong so he can't use this, that he can't get out of this. There was a lot of moments where I'm just like, no, I'm going to take him down. Like, I'm not going to let him get away with this. And then eventually you're literally beaten into submission and you say what you're supposed to say. And when he finally got the recording he wanted, that was the first rape. He had everything set up exactly as he wanted. That was, at that point, like physically exhausted. Like nothing left in me. So completely dissociated from it. I know it. I from a third person point of view, I can watch it happen. And I think thankfully, like that's not something, I want to remember first person. So right. Yeah.
Another
dissociated from it. Yeah.
Kind of good aspect about the trauma brain is that dissociation element that takes you away from that.
Yeah.
Through those times when he was in the apologetic mood, was he bringing you food? Was he letting you
No.
use the restroom? Was he doing anything that would come to a sense in your associative mind think, I can survive this?
Yes and no. So the first day I told you, he kind of brought me ice and he brought me water. After he raped me, he disappeared for a little while. Like I wasn't going to get up and go looking for him. But no, there was no offer of anything except one other instance. And that was, I later found out, was Friday night. So we went from Tuesday night to ultimately Saturday midday. I ended up in the hospital. I was at the hospital. So those 4 days. So Friday night, I found out later that it was Friday night. Like I said, had no recollection of what day was what at that point. He was hungry. He wanted to order food. And he knew that he couldn't go out and get food. He couldn't stop and cook. So from that first rape, eventually he ended up grabbing me. He had my phone again. He ended up coming back in and grabbing me and dragging me out of the room by my hair, dragging me into another bedroom, just on a rage back and forth. There were a couple points where I was like, I have to go to the bathroom. And he didn't want me to go because the last time I said I was going to the bathroom, I left, I ran. He switched to a new tactic to prevent me from running, which was beating the bottom of my feet with that bamboo rod. So he would pin me down and he would just beat my feet and my knees. So at this point, I couldn't walk. I could not walk. And he had like a rolling office chair that he put me into and zip tied me to so that he could drag me around his place so that he could do whatever he wanted. And I had to be right there. Like I was on a leash. And so Friday night it was Friday night and he ended up ordering food, and he's in part of his scheming to prove that I wanted to be there, like that I had gone willingly to his place. And I don't know what the actual narrative in his mind that he was trying to play out was, but in an effort to prove that I was consensually there, he asked me where my wallet was, and I told him it was in the glove box of my car. And he took my keys, went down to my car, got my wallet, ordered food, used my credit card. When the delivery guy came, he had put me in the kitchen and he said, if you make a peep, I'll kill you. And he brought the receipt to me to sign. And this was another opportunity. I thought, okay, can I sign something? Can I put something on this receipt that looks out of place? And I wrote my name. I didn't sign it. I wrote it, like spelled it out instead of my quick signature that I would normally do. And it was very shaky. I mean, I was shaking. At this point, every nerve in my body was on fire. So I wrote out my name, and then I put a very small tip, very deliberately, so that the delivery driver, I was like, he has to remember it. It has to be something he would remember and be, I don't know. I mean, I could have put $100 tip, but I put a super small tip. I think it was like $2, something that seemed wrong. And my captor saw what I was doing and he got pissed. He got very angry and was like, no, like, this is ridiculous. You can't leave that, whatever. And he scratched it out really, really hard. And he made me write in a much bigger tip. And I was like, you just did exactly what I needed him to do. Like, I needed it to be something memorable. I didn't know if I was going to get out. I didn't know if I was going to die there or not, but like, it's just like, I needed someone else to know. I needed there to be like one piece of evidence that, because at this point I think maybe at this point I was absolutely questioning whether I would get out of there or not. I was questioning it.
Sure.
I think at this part, I started to lose hope that I maybe wasn't going to get out. So a lot of those things that I was thinking were just leave a breadcrumb trail, something, something to prove that I was under duress. And I knew that, it's one thing with those videos to say, nope, re-record, nope, try again, nope, try again. This was one receipt going to one person. There was no do it again. There was no hide that. So I think that's what my train of thought was on that.
Yeah.
So that night, so the food arrived and he sat down and he started eating, and he deliberately ordered things that he knows that I don't like certain foods that I just generally don't like. And he put not even child-sized portions, like as if he was like, I can't even say feeding a dog. You'd feed a dog more than this. Like it was, here, you may have one bite of this and one spoonful of rice. I don't even know what else it was. And it was like these portioned little things, this very controlled, very deliberate, like, you are shit to me.
Mm-hmm.
And here you go. And so I didn't want it. I mean, there was nothing in my body that was like, yeah, go ahead and eat now. Like, I was still fully in survival mode. So I said, no, thank you. He forced me to take a couple bites of that just to prove something. And then the entire time, so I have something called misophonia. I don't know if you know what that is. Not a lot of people have it, but some people will know. I later found out that this is actually a trauma response. It's something that happens in our brains. But misophonia is something that some people, the sound of chewing actually angers us. We're very sensitive to certain noises, repetitive noises, like techno music drives me bonkers because it's just too perfect and it's too repetitive. And the sound of chewing or people like smacking their lips or chewing with their mouth open is literally, I mean, it's an uncontrollable, like it's a visceral feeling in my body. Like I don't hear it, I feel it, and it's uncomfortable. And I've had it since I was a kid. It was always just annoying to hear people slurping or gulping or chewing loudly. I never knew what it was called too. Everybody just thought that I was super sensitive or something. And essentially that's what it is. But he knew that that was something that I didn't like. So part of his torture was to do everything he could to pick at anything about me he didn't like. He was trying to break me. And so he sat there in my ear for as long as he possibly could. And I had to just sit there and take it. He did something else to my feet that he knew. So my feet are ticklish. They always have been. There's a very specific thing, like to the bottom of the foot, when you run your finger straight up the middle of it. I don't know, pet peeves, annoyances that I always had. And he always knew that, from when we had dated, he knew that that was a thing. And he would sit there and do that over and over and over. And I had to and it was agonizing because he had beaten my feet. Like my feet were just blue and bruised and I couldn't put any pressure on them. And he would do that over and over and over. And I had to just sit there and pretend it wasn't bothering me, because if he knew something bothered me, he doubled down and he doubled down and he doubled down and he doubled down. So that night that when he went out to my car, actually, to go get my credit card to use that's when he zip tied me, and in the closet, he zip tied me to the chair and locked me in the closet. And he told me if I screamed that he'd kill me. And that's when I started scheming, because he left. I heard his door open, and I waited thinking, okay, can I hear the elevator? Can I hear any evidence that he's actually left? And then he came right back. And then he left and he came right back, and he left and he came right back. And he deliberately created these varying degrees so that he was testing me if I was going to scream or try and get out and run. Then eventually he left and went back, but he had triggered me to the point of fear. Like I really didn't know if he was going to come back. And if I did scream, I had absolutely no doubt that he would be absolutely enraged. All of my energy and attention went to getting to those calm moments, just enduring the pain and the fear and the beatings after beating after beating after beating, just getting to that moment where he was calm, because those were the only moments I could think. So when I was in the closet, I looked around, and it was, like I said, it was a high rise. So there was sprinkler heads everywhere. So that's when I actually devised a plan to get away, was when I was in the closet. And I was like, if I could just break my zip ties, if I could stand on this chair, if I could hit that sprinkler head, it would set the fire alarm off. The architect in me understood how that stuff worked. Yeah. So that's when I started to devise that plan. And I did end up breaking one of the zip ties before he got back, but not the other one, not enough to execute that plan in that moment. And he came back and found the zip tie broken and got pissed, beat the crap out of me again. And then he ended up, when he was done beating me, he went and ordered food, and I just sat there bleeding until the food arrived. Another night, which again, I know this is really disjointed, and I apologize for people. I do have the paperwork from the statements I gave to the police and things like that, which that was actually very much in order. When it was fresh in my mind, it was all in order.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll explain all that. And I don't want you to apologize. I think just that you're sitting here after all of that,
yeah,
like you said, the fact that you actually weren't killed is a miracle in and of itself. Yeah. The fact that you can talk about it is mind-blowing to a lot of people, I'm sure.
Like I said, we'll talk when we talk about the neuroscience of it and everything. I'll tell people exactly how I did it.
Right.
It took me a couple of years to figure it out, and once I did, it was like a light switch, like bam, like done.
I know there are people who listen to this podcast that are going to need to hear that. And so I appreciate you even hinting to that, because
Yeah.
what your story is overwhelmingly sad and hard to hear, but also helpful and important to hear. I think it's really amazing that you're here to talk about this, and I can't thank you enough. I know one of the things that I've said to you in our early conversations is that empathy aspect of it, and I know that's one of the things that you're not real keen on, is hearing I'm really sorry for the experience that you had.
Yeah.
Because you used that experience
I do.
and made it into a thing that you have actually benefited from.
Yeah.
It's
I have absolutely turned it into something really big and important and impactful and purposeful.
We will get to that. And I'm so appreciative that you're using this in ways that are really helpful to people. So thank you.
I was gonna say, there is a question that I always get by this point, and people are like, but I'm like, yeah, spoiler alert, I survived. Like, I'm here.
Mm-hmm.
But the question I always get is, how did you escape? That's what people always want to know. Actually, there's two questions people always ask. One, how did you get away? And two, is he in jail? That's the
So that was exactly where I was going to go, is the aspect of tying in, though, the not just how did you get away, but you ended up in the hospital.
Yeah.
So that says a lot
had to get
too.
There.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I spent, I believe it was 10 days in the hospital, and they wouldn't release me until I could walk on my own and until I had someone safe to be released to. I was in the hospital under an alias. People had to have a special password if they wanted to come visit me. They had to be cleared. They were protecting me from him and anyone he would send after me. Yeah.
Well, the fact that they were informed enough to do that says a lot.
I had an amazing experience in the hospital. The nurses were amazing to me. You know, people often talk about their near-death experiences as like seeing the light or feeling like they've been abducted by aliens and that they're on this table or whatever. I didn't have it as a near-death experience, but I absolutely understood what people were talking about in that, because when you're laying on a very cold metal table, I was naked. I went via ambulance naked. Like, it wasn't even that they cut my clothes off of me. I wasn't wearing any. And there are 10, maybe more. I mean, it feels like 100 hands on you, touching you and poking you and prodding you and drawing blood and checking every inch of your body. And when I say that I was bruised on every inch of my body, there was a stripe down the center of my belly that had no bruises. That was it. I was black and blue. I was completely unrecognizable. And the photos that I have were pictures that a friend took in the hospital several days later, like as some healing went on and they were pumping me with like potassium and all these things to help the swelling go down and everything. So, I look at those pictures and I'm like, who is that person? Yeah. So when you're I was laying in trauma and of course I had been raped and I had been beaten. And the last thing I wanted was anyone touching me, anyone. And there was this one woman that came up and she found a part of my hand that wasn't bruised and she squeezed my hand and she told me her name and she said, I'm here. The only voice you need to listen to is mine. And she held my hand the whole time. When I look back and like you said, I can tell this story and I seem unfazed by it. The things that bring me to tears are the moments I had with people like that. Sorry, This is the emotional part. The emotional part for me was realizing that someone was there to help. So I actually do want to go back and tell another portion of the story, because I think this is something that a lot of people experience. Maybe not exactly under the circumstance I did, but I think the emotions and the feelings that I experienced are relevant to a lot of people. And so at one point, I believe it was late on Friday night, maybe sometime early Saturday morning of the attack. So this was going into day 4. He had come in and dragged me out. I had finally fallen asleep. He barricaded me in a room. He set up all these booby traps and noise things and all this stuff. Barricaded me in a room, locked me in. I finally fell asleep. At some point, my body just gave out and I fell asleep. And he came in, and I know it was 4:32 in the morning because for over a year, I woke up every day at 4:32 in the morning in a panic. It's the only reason why I know exactly what time it is, was when it happened. And he grabbed me by my hair and he dragged me out of the bedroom into the other bedroom. And I don't know what triggered him. I don't know what that rage cycle was about. And he started beating me and he was ripping my hair out, like handfuls of my hair, beating my feet. And he had a knife. And he was running the knife all over my body. He like grabbed my nipple and threatened to cut it off. There was a wrestle and a struggle over the knife at one point, and it sliced through my hand. All of a sudden, he just stopped, and he went and got his phone, and he called his father. And speaking a foreign language that I only understood bits and pieces of, I know he was talking about money, talking about a car, and there was it was anger. It was a this is your fault, Dad kind of anger. And he had video called his dad, and he turned the phone to me, laying bleeding on the floor, naked, bruised, bleeding. And his father saw it. I saw his father's eyes. This is a man I met. This is a man that I had danced with at a restaurant, that I had meals with. And even though we didn't speak the same language, this is a person who looked me right in the eye and turned away. And when I saw his eyes, there was a moment of, okay, someone's coming. I was like, his dad is going to call the police, or his dad is going to call his brother who lives 20 minutes away, and his brother is going to call the police. Like I saw another human being, and I felt like, okay, good. Someone's coming. Someone's going to come rescue me. And I remember trying to calculate in my mind, okay, how long will it take for his dad to call his brother, wake his brother up? Okay, his brother's going to call 911. And I know there's a fire station 2 blocks away. Like, I know this. And so I started this glimmer of hope, like calculating, okay, it's going to take a couple minutes to do this. And then it's going to take a few minutes to do that. And then I'm going to hear the sirens. I'm going to hear them. I'm going to hear them like any minute now, any minute now, any minute now, any minute now. And no one came. Absolutely nothing. Nothing. No one came. And after that phone call is when he dragged me again by my hair back into the other bedroom. He zip tied my hands behind my back, and he put headphones on me. He asked me for what my favorite song was, and I deliberately picked I ruined the song for myself, but I deliberately picked Van Morrison's Moon Dance because I knew it was about a 7-minute song. And I'd always thought, as a little girl, anytime I heard that song, my dad is the first one who ever played it for me. And I always thought at my wedding, I would dance with my dad to that song. And I went and ruined it for myself. But so I picked that song because I knew it was a 7-minute song. And I knew that's how I could keep track of time. I still thought at this point that someone was coming. I still believed at this point that looking another human being in the eye, that someone was going to come. And they didn't. And that song played many, many times. And he blindfolded me. And he had headphones on me. And at one point, I pushed my shoulder up to like move the headphones so I could try and hear who he was calling on the phone. I could feel him pacing back and forth around me. He was smoking cigarettes, and the ash was falling onto my body. And eventually he pulled the blindfold off of me when I had been my wrists were zip tied behind my back, and I had just been pulling and pulling and pulling on them. And I finally snapped one of the zip ties. And he heard that, and he came running, and he ripped the blindfold off of me, and he grabbed an extension cord, and he tied up my hands with it, wrapped it around the middle of my body, tied it to the leg of the bed. And, he was enraged. He was pissed. And I still heard the music blaring like in one of my ears. And he went and got the knife, and he threw the phone on the bed, and then he sat over me in I don't know how to describe it. He wasn't kneeling. He was sort of half kneeling, half leaning over me, and he dragged the knife back and forth all over my body, cutting my chest up. And again, I had been working on like trying to free my hands from this extension cord. And I created some slack, like just enough in one of my hands that I could pull it loose, almost totally free. And I had movement in my elbow, and he there's a cat that's, by the way, involved in this story that I haven't mentioned yet. She's now my cat. But this whole time there's a kitten. The entire time there was a kitten in the house. And I knew that he had done something to this kitten. I could hear her screaming in the other room sometimes and all this stuff. I don't know what. I'll never know. But she and I are best friends now. She's this tiny little kitten. And I'm laying down next to the bed. And I'm just working to free my hand. And I look under the bed and I just see just these two little eyes glint in the light, just these two beep, like kitten eyes. And I just like something in my body. And I had gotten to the point where I was resigned. I had resigned to death. I was like, this is it. He recorded a 10-minute video of me forcing me to say goodbye to my family. Yeah. And so that was it. And I was stalling. I was dragging it out as long as I could because this was the end for me. This was it. I was going to die. So any last bit that I could, just a little bit of life left. I don't know. He finally got tired. He's like, okay, that's long enough. That's enough. That's enough. I'm tired of this. And he threw that phone. It was two different phones. One of them was mine. One was hid. He threw them both onto the bed. He was laying over me. I was trying to loosen my wrist. And I finally got just enough slack in my hand. I look over, I see this little kitten, and there's this little voice in my head that just goes, now. Clear as day, my own voice, as loud as it had been, because I had given up. I had absolutely like given up, and like, okay, I'm gonna die now. And I remember feeling like laying on the floor, and I felt like the floor was swallowing me. And I don't know how to describe that other than like, if you ever lay on a memory foam mattress and you first lay down and then you kind of just, you slowly sink into it. I hate memory foam now, by the way. That's how I can describe it. Is like I laid on the floor and it just like my whole body, I felt this wave of cold go over my whole body, and it just like the floor swallowed me. And it was a really peaceful feeling. It really was calm and peaceful until I saw those little eyeballs under the bed. And that little now voice, it wasn't little, it was huge in my head. It was just like now. And I just used all of my whatever oomph that I had. And I pulled that hand almost free. I threw my body forward just as the knife went into my throat. And I shoulder checked him basically backwards, knocked him off balance, and screamed, call 911, you asshole. And by the way, do not show up to a knife fight naked with one hand tied behind your back. Like, it's not a good idea, people. Yeah. It was, in hindsight, I look at it and I'm like, you idiot. Like, that was the dumbest thing you could have done. And I grabbed my throat and, it's just bleeding everywhere. And he, I had seen these Jekyll and Hyde moments in him, and that's exactly what happened. Like, his face completely changed and he started panicking, like, oh my God, what did I do? What did I do? What did I do? And he started freaking out. And I had just enough slack in, because I was still tied up. I had one arm basically free, like, and the other arm was tied still around my waist, and my hand was free at this point. And I just reached over and I started like pounding on the cell phones just to get them to wake up. And it felt like forever. And finally one did, and I was able to like, do the emergency call, and I called 911, and he sat there with a knife to my throat the entire time on the 911 call. And I had to make up a story fast on 911. I lied to the 911 agent. The first thing out of my mouth was that I was 37-year-old female, laceration to the throat, and I spit out the address. And I knew enough to do that, to be like, they need to know who, what, and where. Like, that's what they need to know first and foremost. And if I didn't have time to tell a story, I needed someone there right away. I was bleeding in my hand, and they were trying to give me instructions on what to do. They were giving me instructions on how to, try to control the bleeding. They were trying to keep me talking. They're like, well, what happened? How did this happen? And again, he's got a knife to my throat on the other side while I'm saying this. And I look over at him, and his eyes were huge, and, he switched different faces, different personalities, and he's not diagnosed schizophrenic. I want people to know that he's not a schizophrenic. This is rage. This is narcissistic rage that happened. And the whole time, and I said that I got in a fight with my boyfriend. I said that I said that I got a fight with my boyfriend and that I did it to myself, that I tried to cut my own throat, which statistically wouldn't happen. Like, it's almost impossible to do, by the way. Like, so I tried to say all the things that gave him peace of mind, that I was going to cover him. Like, I was going to lie for him. I needed him to believe that I wasn't going to throw him under the bus when the cavalry arrived, right? Like, I had to I just that much more time. I had to buy myself, like, just a couple of minutes. And it visibly did, like, he did believe me. He did believe that I was genuine in saying, like, oh yeah, I did this to myself. Like, I don't even know how to describe it, but as if I was being over dramatic and being like, well, I'm going to kill myself then, kind of thing. I let him believe that was the story I was going to stick with. And there was 2 police officers that showed up on site first, and they came up with the security. And again, I didn't know this till after, like, I put the pieces together after, and people told me afterwards what happened. But I heard, while I was on the phone with 911, I heard the police pounding on the door, and he had to make the decision to leave me and go to the door to let them in. And the security guards from the building had come up, and they had a key as well. So they actually unlocked the door, and they couldn't open the door because he still had the whole place barricaded. So he had a chair like underneath the doorknob and everything. So he had to go and clear all that up. And while he was waiting for 911 to call, he cut all my bindings off of me. He threw them out the window. He was running around trying to clean up before anyone came. And 2 cops came in. One came in to me. The other one was outside the room. And the officer said to me, like, where's the knife? I was like, I have no idea. Like, I didn't do this to myself. And he looks and he's like, and I watch his eyes. I mean, he's eye contact with me, asking me, he's looking at my throat, like he's applying pressure. He's doing everything he can to keep me from bleeding out. And he looks at me, and I watch his eyes just go down my whole body. And he's like, what happened here? And I said, it was him, and I've been here for days. All I said. I had nothing else to say. I was done. I was out. I was conscious and aware of what was going on around me. But at that point, I literally was drained, like not just tired, like just empty. I was empty. And the paramedics came in, and they threw a blanket over me. And then I remember just pulling the blanket up over my face. I didn't want to be on camera. I didn't want to be, I was just, there was a sense of relief over me, and just the like I could finally exhale. And I remember, as I'm pulling the blanket up over my face, he was standing in the hall, and the cops had him in handcuffs to arrest him. Actually, right before that happened, they were about to arrest him, and he bust into the room while they were like, I think the word's triage or whatever, when they're doing, like, the first responders were, doing controlling the bleeding. And he busts into the room, and then he goes into his closet, and he says, this is absolutely insane to me that these were the words out of his mouth. He's like, I need to grab a jacket. Jail is cold. Because he was in sweatpants and had no shirt on. And he knew he was going to jail, and he had been there before because he knew it was cold. And the cop let him in the room to do that, and then put him in handcuffs. And I was like, in hindsight, when I had that memory and it was playing back, and I'm like, how mind blown. So that's how I escaped, to answer that question. But those moments of, I had mentioned being on the table in trauma, and then later, after they had controlled the bleeding and I had gotten MRIs and all this stuff, they had moved me into another room, and the officers had to come in and take my statement. And one of the officers was, he was crying. And I had snapped into this like gallows humor. Like, I was kind of joking about things, like, again, part of the trauma process, part of the process of coming out of survival mode is, you kind of make jokes about things you don't believe yet, the
chemical release in the brain,
Yeah.
with the relief of realizing I'm not going to die.
Yeah.
People need to understand that a lot of that is all kinds of a chemical dump that puts you in that kind of mindset of laughing and joking.
And I've always laughed when I was in pain too. Like as a kid, I broke my arm and I was like, nobody believed it was broken because I was laughing. That's some weird thing that happens in the brain. And some people have it and they laugh when they're in pain. And I have a generally high tolerance to pain, I think, because of that chemical reaction.
Sure.
And yeah, so I think a lot of the nurses were like, people, they were laughing with me. Like one of the officers saw one of my legs was exposed and he's like, I have to take photos. Is that okay? And I was like, yeah, go ahead. And he took pictures of that whole side and that leg. And he's like, are there any on the other side? I said, oh yeah, match set. And so like, that was the type of joke that I had, because I finally felt like I was surrounded by people. Like I did actually believe that people wanted to help me. And I know that that's not the reaction. A lot of women who've been raped, and I experienced both. I experienced I don't want anyone to touch me. I don't trust anyone. And then I also experienced those moments of empathy from people, and that they were genuine. And like I said, that's what actually brings me to tears. Telling my story and telling the trauma of it all, that's not where these tears came from. These tears come from those moments of the people who showed up to help, the nurse who held my hand, that officer who looked me in the eye and cried looking at me. There was another nurse that when the detective came in to interview me, the detective was not a pleasant person. It felt like he wasn't even on my side.
Yeah.
It felt like he was there to pick me apart. And he yelled at the nurse. He threatened to arrest one of the nurses because they wouldn't let him in my room because I was getting a procedure done when he showed up. And there was another nurse that came in and sat with me until one of my friends could show up. Before they would let the detective in. And it's like, those people, those were my heroes. Those were the people that like I needed, and they were there. They did the right thing. And those were the people that remind me that there are good people in the world, and that people can be trusted, and that people do want to help. You just have to let them. Yeah.
That does it for this week's Part 1 episode of my interview with Arci Grey. I want to give Arci a special thank you for being on my show. She's a powerful example of survival and thriving after a horrendous trauma. Next week, I'll be bringing you the equally amazing conclusion to my interview with Arci. You won't want to miss hearing about how she transforms trauma into triumph. It truly is powerful. Please share this episode with discretion towards the appropriate consideration of who you share this with. And then rate and subscribe to my podcast, because every little bit helps. And don't forget to do your part to help bring justice to victims and survivors of rape or sexual assault. And start by believing, because we all know someone whose life has been affected by rape or sexual assault. We'll see you next week.